Electra's environment was always one of perfection, a meticulously manicured masterwork of ambition and grace. Every stage of her life had been meticulously planned, as if she were an architect designing a cathedral. She was the eldest daughter of the Forrester clan, a name associated with old money and high aspirations. Her engagement to Will had been the pinnacle of her accomplishments, a union that promised to combine two great families, while solidifying her place in a world that valued status. Will, with his easy charm and calm power, had been the ideal partner, not only a lover but a foundation for her future plans. She'd spent months planning their wedding, each detail a brushstroke in a portrait of their life together. The invitations, engraved with gold leaf, had already been distributed to a guest list that read like a who's who of New England's elite. The menu, created by a Michelin-starred chef, promised a symphony of sensations to match their love. The dress? Oh, the dress! Was hand-stitched in Milan, a waterfall of silk and pearls that made her feel like a queen. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. The East Parlor was a relic from the mansion's past, a space rarely used by the inhabitants. Its rich velvet draperies and golden furniture evoked an era of grandeur that the Forresters had long since outgrown, but Electra had always found it strangely soothing. It was a place where time stood still, and the weight of her family's heritage seemed less heavy. She had come here tonight on a whim, tired of going over seating charts and floral arrangements all evening. Will had become aloof recently, his normal friendliness replaced by a preoccupation she couldn't identify. She had believed it was the burden of their upcoming wedding, the weight of integrating their lives in front of their families. But when she entered the parlor, the truth struck her like a physical blow. Will and Luna stood in the center of the room, silhouetted by the moonlight, like figures in a tragic picture. Luna, Electra's childhood friend and maid of honor at her wedding, was a picture of exquisite beauty. Her auburn hair reflected the silver light, and her eyes, which were usually filled with joy, were clouded with something raw and vulnerable. Will wrapped his arms around her, not in passion, but in a protective grip that screamed of shared secrets. Electra's gaze lowered to Luna's hands, which were softly pushed against her abdomen, and the realization hit her like a tidal wave. Pregnant. The word was a razor, slashing through the delicate threads of her poise. She wanted to scream, demand answers, and break the silence that hung between them like a guillotine. But her voice betrayed her, stuck in her throat like a stone. Will's eyes met hers, wide with fear and remorse, and the sound of her name on his lips was an agonizing plea she couldn't bear to hear. Luna's tears flowed freely, each one a mute admittance of the truth. The air in the room became oppressive and stifling, as if the walls were closing in. Electra's thoughts raced, recreating every moment of the last few months, looking for hints she had overlooked. Will discounted the late-night phone calls as work. Luna had become quieter during their planning sessions, and Electra had chalked up the faint glances they exchanged to familiarity. How had she been so blind? The treachery was not only personal, it was cosmic. Electra had constructed her life on the principle of control, believing that if she prepared carefully enough, she could mold her future. She had chosen Will not merely for love, but for the life they could create together. One of power, beauty, and legacy. Luna, her confidant since infancy, was the only person she trusted implicitly, knowing every fear and dream Electra had ever shared in the dark. And now they plotted to steal it all away. The kid growing inside Luna was a living emblem of their betrayal, representing a future that belonged to them rather than her. The notion was excruciating, a visceral anguish tearing at her chest. Electra's legs trembled, but she didn't collapse. She was, after all, a Forrester forged in the fires of expectation. She forced herself to breathe, each inhale a conscious effort of resistance against the pandemonium that threatened to overwhelm her. How long? She eventually spoke, her voice low and harsh, cutting through the silence like a dagger. Will flinched as if struck, and dropped his arms from Luna's shoulders. Luna's sob pierced the silence, a harsh sound that seemed to match the crack in Electra's heart. It wasn't planned, Will explained, his voice barely above a whisper. It just happened. The words were fragile and inadequate, a lame attempt to bridge the gap between them. Electra's laugh was harsh and unlike of her. Did it just happen? She repeated, each syllable laced with hate. Do you think that makes this better? That it erases everything you've done? Luna stepped forward, her palms raised to cross the gap between them. "Electra, I'm very sorry," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I never intended to hurt you. We never intended for this to happen." But the words were empty and useless in light of the truth. Electra's gaze flickered to Luna's tummy, where life was blossoming, and the sight was like a fresh wound. She wanted to detest Luna and Will, but her feelings were too complex and twisted. Yes, she was angry, but she was also very saddened by the loss of her life. She turned away, unable to take the sight of them anymore. The moonlight appeared colder now, its silver radiance betraying the warmth it had once promised. She went out of the room, her steps measured and deliberate, each one a refusal to show them her weakness. But within she was disintegrating. The future she had imagined? Will's hand in hers as they danced at their wedding, the sound of their children's joy resounding through the hallways of this mansion, had vanished. In its place came a blank, a gaping chasm that threatened to swallow her whole. The days that followed were a haze of anguish and pretense. Electra canceled the wedding with a single, brief phone call to the coordinator, her voice steady despite the tempest brewing inside her. The invites were recalled, the dress was returned, and the dream was dismantled in pieces. She ignored Will and Luna, declining their calls and deleting their texts before reading them. The Forrester home, once a symbol of her family's strength, has become a prison. Every room evoked memories of Will. His laughter in the library, his touch in the garden, and his promises in the quiet moments they shared. She couldn't get away from him, from the betrayal that had ruined everything. Naturally, her relatives observed the difference in her. Her mother, a woman of strength and grace, pressed for an answer, but Electra evaded with practiced ease. She couldn't bear to acknowledge the truth and see the sympathy in their eyes. Her father, ever the stoic patriarch, simply cocked an eyebrow and inquired whether she required a lawyer. She did not. She sought a method to regain herself, to reconstruct the life that had been taken away from her. But how do you rebuild if the foundation is shattered? She pushed herself into work, drowning her sorrow in the ceaseless demands of the Forrester enterprise. Board meetings, charity galas, and international agreements were her refuge, a means to block out the memories. But at night, when all was silent, the ache came back with a vengeance. She'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, repeating the scene in the East Parlor. The image of Will and Luna, trapped in their secret world, plagued her. She wondered what they were doing now, if they were together, preparing a life for the child who should have been hers. The notion was a poison, infiltrating her mind and tainting every moment of calm. Weeks slipped into months and the sharp edges of her suffering began to fade. Not because she was healing, but because she was learning to cope with it. She began to notice the world again, the way the sunshine streamed through the trees, the sound of laughter in the background. She began to recreate her life, not the one she had lost, but a new one that was independent of Will or Luna or the promises they had violated. She traveled, immersing herself in new experiences. Paris, Tokyo, Cape Town. With each trip taking her further away from the past. She met new people, made new connections, and gradually, painfully rediscovered herself. But the scar lingered. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the loss of trust, the awareness that the people she cared about the most could harm her so badly. She learned to guard her emotions and keep her flaws hidden away. She grew sharper and more guarded, and she stopped believing in fairy stories. The Forrester name propelled her ahead like a shield and a sword, yet it could not erase the memories of that beautiful night. Years later, she heard about Will and Luna from mutual contacts. They had married, had a daughter, and established a peaceful existence in a little village far from Electra's bright world. She felt a pang of sadness rather than jealousy. She didn't hate them anymore. She'd let it go. But she could not forget either. The East Parlor remained unchanged, a silent reminder of how her life had changed that night. Even though she had rebuilt her life, stronger and more vibrant than before, a part of her would always remain in that doorway, trapped in the moonlight, watching her dreams collapse. Electra's quest was not about forgiveness or vengeance, but about survival. She had lost something valuable, but she had also acquired something. Resilience forged in the crucible of suffering. The moonlight no longer accused her. Instead, it lit her, reminding her that even at the darkest times, there was light to be found. She no longer resembled the lady who had stood in that salon, But she carried her with her, a silent power that guided her over time. And in the end she was sufficient. Elena and Marcus gradually fell into despair in the days following Eric's ultimatum. The Forrester estate, once a symbol of grandeur and opportunity, now resembled a gilded cage, its sumptuous corridors choking with anxiety. Elena went through the rooms like a ghost, clutching her stuff with quivering fingers. Each item, a sketchbook filled with her dreams, a scarf Marcus had given her on a late-night walk, contained a memory that wounded her heart. She could still hear Marcus' voice, raw with desperation, pleading with her to stay and fight for their love. But the weight of Eric's words, the patriarch's firm pronouncement, pressed down on her like a storm cloud. Outside, the Los Angeles sky looked deceptively bright, with palm trees swinging in a breeze carrying the perfume of jasmine. Elena sat on the edge of the guest room bed, looking at the engagement ring on her finger. It was a lovely piece, a sapphire nestled in a white gold band, a keepsake from Marcus's mother Darla, who died too young. The ring represented not just a promise of love, but also a future in which Elena could belong to someone. It seemed like a shackle, tying her to a fantasy that was fading away. Marcus was downstairs, pacing the marble entryway with his phone clamped against his ear. He called every family member he could think of, including Ridge, Brooke, and his estranged mother, Donna, pleading for help. But the Forresters were a clan devoted to Eric, and while few sympathized, none dared to question the patriarch. Brooke, with her experience of struggling for love over all difficulties, came the closest to understanding. She met Marcus in the yard, her gaze warm and compassionate. "I know what it's like to be on the outside," she added quietly. "But Eric has made up his mind. Marcus, he's preserving the family legacy. You know how he is." "Legacy?" Marcus spat with his fists clenched. "What good is a legacy if it divides us? Elena's not a threat. She's the only thing that makes sense in my existence." Brooke patted his arm, but her silence said more than words. She had fought her own battles with the Forresters and faced years of judgment for her past, but she understood the consequences of opposing Eric. "Give him time," she finally said. "He might come around." However, they did not have the luxury of time. The clock was ticking, and each day brought us closer to the deadline Eric had set. Elena attempted to stay strong by sketching in her notebook to keep her thoughts occupied, but her lines were jagged and her colors were subdued. The vivid drawings that had once piqued the interest of Forrester's elite were now tinged with sadness, as if her pencil was spilling her heartache onto the page. Marcus discovered Elena on the balcony overlooking the estate's expansive gardens one evening, as the sun painted the sky in orange and pink shades. She was draped in a shawl, her dark hair unbound, and her gaze fixated on the horizon. He stood behind her, their shoulders brushing, and for a brief moment, they were simply two people in love, not pawns in a family drama. "I won't let him win," Marcus screamed. "We may leave, Elena. Restart somewhere else. New York, Paris, or wherever. I don't need this family or this name." Elena turned to him, her eyes gleaming. "You say it now, but this is your world, Marcus. Your history. Your mother's ring, your grandfather's empire. It defines you. If you leave, you'll wake up one day and blame me for it." "That's not true," he argued, grasping her hands. "You're my world now." But doubt persisted in her eyes, a shadow that grew larger with each passing hour. She had seen what the Forrester name represented, the power it wielded, and the expectations it entailed. She was a nobody in their opinion, a girl from a small town with a shady family past. The rumors of her brother's fraud case and her grandmother's desperate thievery had spread like wildfire throughout the fashion industry. Paparazzi lingered outside the estate, taking images and waiting for the next controversy to unfold. The fifth day delivered another blow. Eric held a family meeting and gathered everyone in the great dining room. The big mahogany table was set with crystal glasses, but the mood was anything from joyous. Eric stood at the head, commanding despite the lines of age on his face. "This wedding," he replied calmly, "would bring nothing but humiliation to our name. I've learned more about Elena's past, and it's worse than I expected." Marcus stood with his chair scratching across the floor. "What are you talking about? You have already dragged her family through the muck. What more could there be?" Eric slid a folder over the table, spilling out its contents. Old newspaper clippings, legal records, and a grainy photo of a young Elena at her brother's trial. Her brother didn't just commit fraud, Eric said. He was involved in a ring that targeted fashion firms, including ours. Do you think it is a coincidence that she is here, working for us and becoming close to you? The room erupted in murmuring. Rich frowned as flipping over the documents. Thorne shook his head, murmuring about preserving the corporation. Even Brooke was troubled, her devotion to Eric competing with her pity for Marcus. Elena, who had been requested to attend, stood still in the doorway, her face devoid of color. That's not true, she said quietly. I had nothing to do with Javier's behavior. I was a child when that occurred. So why didn't you tell us? Eric demanded. Why hide it? I did not hide it. Elena's voice cracked. I've left that life behind. I came here to establish something fresh and prove myself. I love Marcus, not your empire. But the harm had been done. Doubt spread throughout the family, including Marcus, despite his best efforts. That night they clashed in the guest house, their voices low yet piercing. Why haven't you told me about your brother? Marcus inquired, pacing. I could have handled it. We could have faced it together. I was ashamed, Elena said, her tears flowing. I figured if I told you, you'd see me differently. Like they do now. Marcus drew her into his arms, but the embrace felt flimsy, like it could break with the slightest touch. Elena made up her mind the next morning. She couldn't stay and watch the family she had planned to join fall apart. She packed the last of her belongings and left Marcus a note saying, I love you too much to let you lose everything. Be cheerful. Elena. When Marcus saw the note, he ran through the mansion looking for her, but she was gone. He traveled to her new downtown flat, which was small above a laundromat, but she refused to open the door. Go back to them, she shouted across the woods, her voice muffled by tears. Please, Marcus. Don't make this harder. He waited there for hours, the rain soaking his clothes, before ultimately leaving defeated. The days that followed were a swirl of rage and anguish. He immersed himself into photographing Forrester's new collection, but the images were flat and lifeless. Elena, meantime, attempted to rebuild by taking freelance design assignments, but her heart was not in it. Her doodles, which had previously served as an escape, now felt like a reminder of what she had lost. Eric's heart attack marked a watershed moment in his life. Marcus sat at his bedside, torn between obligation and resentment. Eric's mumbled apology. I thought I was saving you? Did little to soothe the hurt. Elena's absence was a persistent anguish, a gap that widened with each unanswered phone call. Elena's fatal tragedy was a harsh twist in an already tragic story. Marcus stood at her grave with the sapphire ring in his pocket, heavy as a stone. The Forresters lamented, but Marcus bore the greatest burden, knowing that love, so pure and strong, had been crushed by fear and pride. The mansion, once a symbol of authority, now stood empty, its walls resonating with the ghost of what could have been.